So we're just waiting for more people to arrive. So we will start at 7:10. If you want to go outside, you can mingle for a little bit, and we will start here at 7:10. Thank you. Here's Minister. Here's Minister Bausch. Have you met him? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, doesn't it? Yeah. Oui. Okay. Super. Thank you. Hello. Yeah. Hi. Hello. Hello. Hi. 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 I'm very well. How are you? Nice to see you. I'm quite sure you will have. I'm sure you will. Yeah. Yes, I know. You're matching it. You're definitely in. No, you're totally in keeping with the lights. Oh, thank you so much. That's super. Merci, merci. Mais merci. Ok, c'est pour.
Directeur de la fondation du collège de...
Ah, enchanté, enchanté. Merci beaucoup pour l'ordinateur. Oh, super, parfait. Donc le speaker pour ce soir, c'est Paul ici avec. Oui, oui, oui. Oh, c'est très gentil. Merci, merci, merci. J'ai rien avec moi en ce moment, mais après, oui, oui. Tout le monde sont ici en ce moment. Bonjour, Lisa. Enchantée, Lisa. Excuse-moi un moment. Merci, merci. Oh, hi, Sergio. Hello. How are you? I'm so nice to see you. Hello, everyone. Good evening. It's so lovely to see you all here. We were a little concerned about traffic situations, but wonderful to have you here, Your Excellencies, Minister Bausch. A wonderful event here. The first time we have the Luxembourg Autonomous Weapons Systems Conference. Welcome to all of you joining us online. For anyone here present in the room, if you need a translation headset, they're available at the back of the room. And there is also live translation into French on the government's YouTube channel. This is an international public conference. We're welcoming stakeholders here present and members of the public as well, governments, industry, academics, and civil society all together to discuss this incredibly important topic. It's a platform to discuss the risks and challenges associated with the use of autonomous weapons systems, AWS, the technological advancements, the ethical issues, and the legal issues, besides many more. 22 July 2022, the Luxembourg Government Council agreed to the establishment of an inter-ministerial working group on lethal autonomous weapon systems. And the results from this two-day conference will help develop a position for Luxembourg on this topic, that coupled with a survey, which we'll hear more about in a moment. But to formally open this event, please welcome François Bausch, Minister of Defense for Luxembourg.
Good evening and welcome to Luxembourg, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and I hope that you are not too much disturbed by this Metallica concert that will take place also on these grounds here tonight. And so we did good to wait 10 minutes more so that everybody could come into the room. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Luxembourg Autonomous Weapons System Conference. We gather here for 2 days to discuss a topic of ever-growing importance, namely autonomous weapons systems, which is an issue particularly close to my heart. And I'm very pleased that also today Mr. Ernie Gillen is here, because he was the guy that 10 years ago brought me to these topics to discuss about and to analyze the situation about artificial intelligence and the chances and also the risks that are behind it. I'm convinced that new technologies, especially artificial intelligence, hold potentially and present opportunities for the development of our modern societies. But however, in combination with weapon systems and without any rules regarding their use, they can become a major threat to our society and to the security of us all. The impact of artificial intelligence on our daily life is currently widely and publicly discussed. ChatGPT or AI image generators are the most well-known and visible examples of this emerging technology. How such technology will change our daily life is still being assessed. On the level of the European Union, the proposed Artificial Intelligence Act will be the world's first law by a major legislator. But however, it is limited to the European Union and does not contain provisions on military use. Many countries, the European Union, NATO, and also the United Nations are currently working on defining their positions on autonomous weapons systems. Today, war is back in Europe. Russia wages a war of aggression against Ukraine. They invaded a free and democratic country. This horrific war, which Luxembourg strongly condemns, is fought using not only traditional weapon systems, but also new weapon systems, including emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence. In an ideal world, we would not have to discuss the downsides of artificial intelligence, and we would not need to ponder autonomy in weapon systems. But Like we all know, unfortunately, reality is different. Thus, we need to tackle challenges like weapon systems enhanced by emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence that could make them autonomous. What are the dangers of these autonomous weapons systems? Simply put, they are a type of technology that could be used to carry out indiscriminate combat activities with little or no human intervention. While the famous Terminators from the movies are still science fiction, systems like drones with autonomous futures are very real and under development. And therefore, we need to tackle technological but also strategic, legal, humanitarian, and ethical questions right now. That is why we have gathered here in Luxembourg. We do not want to stop innovation. Many of the technologies in questions are dual-use technologies with the potential for both civilian and military application. The technology will continue to be developed, but however, we need to introduce regulations to ensure responsible use. We also need to consider ethical and legal implications of the use and especially misuse of these weapons. Luxembourg established a national interministerial working group. This group is tasked to prepare a report to help the government defining an official position in this challenging and difficult domain. The insights of the huge amount of experts present in Luxembourg tonight and tomorrow will help to get an overall view on this complex topic and to shape the position of Luxembourg. In addition to this, it is of utmost importance to me to have the Luxembourgish population involved and to give them the possibility to provide input and have their voice heard. And therefore, we have launched a public consultation tonight. You will find the link to it here in the room and on the conference web pages. The survey will be available for 1 month. It includes a learning hub and questions on the topic of autonomous weapons systems. Please tell us what you think about it. To kick off this conference and the many discussions we will have over the next days, I am very happy to have Dr. Paul Shah here tonight. He's a former military and award-winning author and played a leading role in establishing policies on unmanned and autonomous systems for the Office of the Secretary of Defense of the United States Department. So thank you to be here. His keynote speech will illustrate the challenges we are all facing and be a good basis for the discussions between the experts we have planned for tomorrow. I am looking forward to learning from the exchanges between policymakers, military decision makers, humanitarian organizations, human rights activists, academia, and industry. After the keynote speech and the following question and answer sessions, I invite you to join our networking cocktail, and I wish you all a great conference, insightful discussions, and speeches. So thank you, and Dr. Paul Shah, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Minister Bausch and Ms. Burke, for that introduction. And thank you all for being here in person and online and for joining us for this important discussion. This is vitally important that this is a conversation that's not just among governments and experts and lawyers, but also among the general public, because we all have a stake in the world that we're building, whether it's with new AI-enabled weapons or how we might use artificial intelligence across society writ large. I want to start with a story that I often reflect on when I think about the challenge of autonomous weapons. I served in the US Army during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And early in the war in Afghanistan, I was part of an Army Ranger sniper team that was sent up to the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. Is this coming through okay? Yeah? Is that better? There's like a weird echo, right? Okay. Let's see if that's any better. I was part of an Army Ranger sniper team that was sent up to the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, and we were there to watch for insurgents coming across the border. We infiltrated at night, and we climbed the ridgeline in darkness, and we settled into our hide site where we hoped that we would be protected when the sun came up. And in fact, once the sun rose, we were very exposed. We were in a part of the country that didn't have much vegetation, and a farmer came out in his fields, and he spotted us very quickly. And we knew that Taliban fighters were coming to attack us. What I didn't foresee is what they would do next, is they sent a little girl to scout out our position. She was maybe 5 or 6, and she had a couple goats with her as cover that she was supposed to be herding goats. But it was pretty clear she was there to watch us. She was not very sneaky, and she walked a long, slow circle around us, and she watched us. We watched her. And we heard what we later realized was the chirping of a radio that she carried on her, reporting back information about our position. So we watched her for a while, and she left. And not long after, some Taliban fighters did come. So we took care of them, and then the gunfight that ensued brought out the whole valley, so we had to leave. But later that night, we were discussing what would we do if we ran into a similar situation, where we saw a civilian who may or may not be working for the enemy, and we talked about maybe we would try to detain them briefly and see if they had a radio on them so we would know if we were compromised. Something that did not come up, that no one suggested, was the idea of shooting this little girl. No one suggested that. Now, what's interesting is that the law of war does not set an age for combatants. So by scouting for the enemy, she was directly participating in hostilities. And under the law of war, she was a valid combatant. So if you programmed a robot to perfectly comply with the law of war, it would have shot this little girl. Now, I think that would be wrong, morally, if not legally. It's certainly not consistent with the values that I was raised with. But it raises the question, how would a robot know the difference between what is legal and what is right? And how would you program those rules in? And more broadly, are we comfortable handing over these life and death decisions to machines? The stakes are high. We can see unfolding in Ukraine a brutal war, and Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine and their continued atrocities show the importance of compliance with international humanitarian law, with the law of war. At the same time, we can see the necessity of giving states every legal means to defend themselves from aggression when we see Ukrainians fighting for their freedom and their very lives. And so we're faced with these difficult choices with this technology. How we approach the issue of autonomous weapons, of machines that might have the ability to make their own decisions about whom to kill on the battlefield. This is not the first time that humanity has grappled with this challenge of new, dangerous technologies. 155 years ago, states came together in Europe to discuss a dangerous new technology coming out of a different revolution, the Industrial Revolution. And the result was the 1868 St. Petersburg Declaration on exploding and expanding bullets. And this new technology, the ability of bullets that would explode on impact, had the potential to cause far more grievous injuries to combatants. And so states outlawed them. And in fact, that declaration was the first in a wave of arms control efforts over the next half century, from 1868 up to the outbreak of World War II. And countries met together to discuss challenges that included aircraft and balloons that could leap over front lines and attack undefended cities, poison gas that could cause agonizing deaths on the battlefield, and submarines, which upended long-standing rules of maritime warfare. Today, we're grappling with a new set of technologies coming out of a new revolution, the artificial intelligence revolution. Just as the Industrial Revolution transformed warfare by changing the physical means of warfare and offloading physical labor to machines, the artificial intelligence revolution is changing the intelligence or cognitive aspects of warfare, offloading cognitive tasks to machines. But that's going to raise difficult questions about what tasks we want machines to do versus people. What happens when a drone has as much autonomy as a self-driving car? What decisions in war require uniquely human judgment, and why? Autonomous weapons pose profound legal, ethical, and stability concerns. From a legal standpoint, how do we ensure that weapons are used in a way that complies with the law of war if they're making their own decisions about whom to attack on the battlefield? Autonomous weapons, to be used lawfully, must comply with the principle of distinction. They must only be used to target combatants, not civilians. They also must be used in accordance with the principle of proportionality, that any collateral damage is not disproportionate to the military necessity of the target that's being attacked. In some settings, these rules will be easier to comply with. So, for example, an autonomous weapon that is undersea, hunting submarines, would be easier to comply with these principles than one that's targeting military targets in an urban area where there might be civilians nearby. But there are also important ethical challenges that this technology raised that might go beyond what's in the law of war. What would it mean if no one felt responsible for killing on the battlefield? Would that make warfare more likely to happen? Would it make wars more dangerous and more lethal? And what does that mean for us as a society if we went to war and no one felt responsible for killing that happened in war? Autonomous weapons also raise very important concerns about stability among countries and the ability to maintain control over military forces, whether it's during crises and militarized disputes, and the potential for autonomous weapons to accidentally escalate conflicts, or while a war is unfolding, managing escalation and war termination, ending wars. Making sure that humans have the ability to retain control over warfare is vitally important to make sure that we can avoid some of its worst harms. Some Chinese scholars have hypothesized about a future where more and more artificial intelligence and autonomy is incorporated into military forces that leads at a point in time in the future to what they've termed a singularity on the battlefield. A point in time where the pace of action eclipses humans' ability to respond. And militaries are fighting at machine speed, and humans are left outside of the loop. And that's a very troubling prospect, because it risks losing control over warfare. Now, I'm not going to contend that the answers to these questions that I'm posing are going to be easy, but as we wrestle with these questions and what to do about them, we should take heart in the fact that we're not the first people to struggle to contain these new dangerous technologies. So what lessons can we learn from prior attempts at arms control? The track record of managing arms control of other technologies is very mixed. There are many examples of successes and failures. And there's enough on both sides for people to often pick the examples that match whatever argument they want to make. So for people who say, well, we should ban autonomous weapons, they can point to prior bans on chemical and biological weapons, blinding lasers, landmines, cluster munitions. For those who say autonomous weapons can't be banned, they can point to attempts in the early 20th century to regulate aerial bombardment of cities, submarines, or even going back to the Middle Ages, the papal ban on the crossbows. 2 popes actually banned crossbows. Didn't work. But there are some key lessons that we can take from these efforts. One clear lesson is that success in restraining the use of weapons in war is not merely a question of political will. The way in which the rules for governing weapons are constructed matters a great deal in whether those prohibitions are likely to succeed. The best rules have clear, bright lines between what is permitted and what is not. States have the ability to comply with those rules, and they can verify others' compliance. Agreements alone are meaningless if states do not adhere to them in wartime. There were many instances in the past where states adopted legally binding treaties which were then violated in wartime. For example, poison gas was banned in 1899 and 1907, yet this did not stop its use in World War I. States adopted rules of maritime warfare in 1907, 1930, 1936 that governed the use of submarines and that prevented them from firing without warning on merchant vessels. But these fell apart in war. States came together to ban attacks by balloons and aircraft on undefended cities in 1899 and 1907. Yet this did not stop aerial bombardment, whether by balloons or aircraft, in World Wars I and II. Treaties can be useful coordinating mechanisms between states to agree on rules governing warfare. But they alone do not guarantee compliance in war. What is essential for compliance in war is reciprocity. States withhold using a dangerous weapon because they are concerned about how other states will respond in kind. So agreements are the beginning, not the end, of restraint. We also can see through these historical examples that discerning the future path of new technologies can be very difficult. In many cases, states correctly understood that some new technologies would create novel challenges. They were right to focus attention on exploding bullets, poison gas, submarines, and air-delivered weapons. What they often got wrong, however, was the specific form of this technology. And this is very important lessons for how we approach autonomous weapons today, a new and evolving technology. For example, the 1899 declaration that banned poison-filled projectiles was the first large-scale use of poison gas was released by canister in World War I. So the prohibition was on projectiles. It was used in canisters. Technically, this was permitted, but it was clearly against the spirit of these prohibitions. And then once states began using gas in World War I, of course, they turned to projectiles that were more effective. States similarly correctly anticipated the horrors of aerial bombardment against cities, but not the specifics of how the technology would play out. The 1907 ban on aerial bombardment prohibited attacks on undefended cities, not anticipating the reality that bombers would always be able to penetrate air defenses. So technology evolves in unpredictable ways. Now, we should take heart in the fact that states correctly foresaw the technologies that would cause problems. But the lesson here is to be careful in crafting agreements so they are robust to the specific form of how a technology evolves. A successful example of this is the ban on blinding lasers. It does not set a technology-based threshold, such as regulating a certain power of laser. Instead, it focuses on the intended use of the weapon to intentionally cause blinding. So this approach is robust to details of how the technology might evolve. Now, some of these examples I'm giving are of attempts that failed. So what do successful arms control agreements look like? Over the last 150 years, we have seen successful regulations or bans on many weapons: chemical and biological weapons, landmines, cluster munitions, blinding lasers, weapons with non-X-ray detectable fragments, using the environment as a weapon, placing nuclear weapons on the seabed, placing weapons of mass destruction in space, nuclear testing, nuclear proliferation, quantities of nuclear weapons, and placing weapons of any kind in Antarctica or on the moon. We've also seen states agree to cooperate to limit, for a period of time, the size of their navies, anti-ballistic missile systems, and certain types of WMD-capable missiles. There have even been examples of tacit cooperation among states with no formal agreement in place to restrict the use or deployment of weapons including bayonets, neutron bombs, and debris-causing anti-satellite weapons. So we actually have lots of examples of successful bans, many of which are in fact against new technologies before they were fielded. So what do these successful examples have in common? First, clear, bright lines between what is permitted and what is not are essential for bans to succeed. Why were countries successful in restraining the battlefield use of poison gas in World War II, but not aerial bombardment of cities? The rules on gas were simpler. The prohibition on gas was very simple: no gas. It wasn't some gas over here, but not over here. It was simply no gas. Aerial bombardment rules, on the other hand, were much more complicated. Aerial bombardment of military targets was allowed, just not civilian areas. Of course, many industrial targets that support the war effort are located in cities. And so states wrestled with rules of air warfare for 40 years, from 1899 to 1939, trying to come up with a set of rules that would allow attacks on military targets, but not civilian ones. Many of these rules looked good on paper, but they failed in war. The rule that some bombing over here, but not over here, proved too complicated for militaries to comply with in war. Which brings me to my second point. States must be able to actually comply with a ban in wartime. States have imperfect control over their military forces. The collapse of restraint on aerial bombardment in World War II illustrates this point. Early in the war, Germany refrained from bombing British cities. Not because there was a legally binding treaty in effect. Germany bombed Poland, which lacked the ability to retaliate. It was because Hitler was afraid of the British Air Force. He knew that if he bombed British cities, Britain would bomb German cities. And so Hitler issued a directive earlier in the war that bombing in Britain was only to be directed against military targets, not against civilian areas. Again, not because there was a treaty in effect, certainly not because he was a humanitarian, because of reciprocity. And for a time, this restraint actually held early in the war. Then in the night of August 24th, 1940, several German bombers got lost and strayed in the night and bombed central London by mistake. Churchill retaliated by bombing Berlin, and Hitler launched the London Blitz. And all restraint was gone after that. So states must actually be able to comply with rules in wartime, given the messiness of war, the chaos and friction of war, and imperfect control over their military forces, if regulations are able to succeed. Third, states must be able to verify whether or not others are complying with a ban. This can be accomplished, and is sometimes in the past, through formal verification regimes that allow for countries to have inspectors to inspect military facilities. But these are not always necessary. There are examples of successful bans that do not have formal verification regimes. But if states are going to give up a weapon, especially if they see that weapon as valuable, they're going to want to know that others are complying with that ban too. Fourth, states must believe that the downsides to using a weapon outweigh its military value. Weapons have been banned throughout history for many reasons. Because they increase combatant suffering, because they are indiscriminate to civilians, because they are destabilizing, or maybe they upset the prevailing political order at the time. For states to want to ban a weapon, they must see the horribleness of that weapon as outweighing its military benefits. This is particularly a challenge for new weapons that have yet to be used in war. States may be reluctant to give up a weapon that might be valuable, and they may not fully understand its horrors until it is used. So why were states successful in restraining the battlefield use of poison gas in World War II, but not World War I? Well, in World War I, it was an unknown weapon. And for many militaries at the time, they saw it as potentially valuable, even a war-winning weapon. Germany saw it as one that could help potentially break the stalemate of the front lines. States also did not know the horribleness of poison gas until they'd experienced it. Now, by the time you got to World War II, The major powers entered World War II with each having tens of thousands of tons of stockpiled mustard gas. They had it available, but they didn't use it. And it wasn't because there was a treaty banning it. There had been a treaty before World War I also. It was because leaders at the time had seen the horrors of poison gas and the suffering that it inflicted. And they knew that gas was not a decisive war-winning weapon. They knew that the only effect of using poison gas was that their adversary would also use it and would elevate the war to a new level of mutually assured suffering with no advantage to either side. Preemptive bans have some ways that make them easier than others. They have the benefit of targeting weapons that are not yet integrated into states' military arsenals. States don't rely on these preemptive weapons for defense yet. So they don't yet have bureaucratic institutions that are invested in these weapons. And that might make it easier to restrain them. But what makes it more difficult is that states may also not fully understand the effects of these weapons in warfare. The challenge before us is great. States must craft rules that are workable in the most extreme circumstances, when negotiations have failed, when nations have turned to force to solve their disputes. If states can craft rules that have clear, bright lines that states can comply with, that allow states to verify others' compliance, and that focus on instances where the horribleness of a weapon outweighs its military value, there have been many successful examples of bans or regulations on weapons. So how can we apply these lessons today? The international community deserves a tremendous amount of credit for being ahead of this issue. Countries were coming together at the United Nations almost a decade ago in 2014 to discuss autonomous weapons. Long before AI was dominating news headlines, long before it had captured the attention of the wider public, countries were actually discussing these issues and leading into these. And I think that's worth acknowledging. And that's a tremendous advantage that states have had the ability to try to get ahead of a very rapidly moving technology. But of course, one of the difficulties is that technology is moving much faster than diplomacy. And so even though the international community has been very forward-leaning, we're seeing the AI revolution continue and progress is moving very quickly. Artificial intelligence is enabling more advanced autonomous systems being developed by military powers. But one of the most difficult challenges with this technology is that it's not coming out of the military space. It's being driven, in fact, out of the civilian sector. And that's where the biggest advances in artificial intelligence and autonomy are coming from, which means that this technology is widely available to anyone who wants to access it. And that can make controlling the technology much more difficult because many more actors are needed to reach agreement and to have restraint. To just take the case of drones, which are not autonomous weapons and are largely remote controlled today. But drones are used by over 100 countries and non-state groups. So even though these are remote controlled, they're adding increasing autonomous functionality. And we can see how widely available the technology is. Drones are proliferating very rapidly around the globe, driven by a number of different countries. If you just look at the war in Ukraine, two of the leading countries supplying drones are Turkey and Iran. We're also seeing technologies come directly out of the civilian space and being integrated into military forces. We're seeing in Ukraine quadcopters and hexcopters that people are buying off the civilian market and then modifying, being used in the conflict. And while these are generally smaller than military drones, they have smaller endurance and payload and range, many times their autonomous features are actually more advanced on the civilian drones because of how rapidly the technology is evolving. We're seeing these technologies come together already in the war in Ukraine in ways that are very close to autonomous weapons. Videos surfaced last year from the war that showed civilian drones equipped with machine learning-based image classifiers. Now, these image classifiers can look at objects. They can look at a video feed, a camera, a drone image, and they can identify objects within this camera field of view. And they use machine learning to do that. And these machine learning tools are available online. They're free to download. They can be used by anyone who has some fairly basic programming skills. And in these videos, these machine learning tools were placed on drones, and the drones could navigate around the battlefield in Ukraine, and the drones could automatically identify objects within their field of view. This is a truck, this is a tank, for example. And in one instance, this AI tool was used to carry out a lethal attack. In the video, the drone flies over a wooded area, and down among the trees is a Russian tank. And the drone machine learning system automatically spots the Russian tank. It labels it. The drone maneuvers to get closer, drops a small explosive payload to blow up the tank. Now, in this video, it seems as though a human was still in the loop, but all of the components to build lethal autonomous weapons are there, demonstrated already a year ago in the war in Ukraine. These are effectively turnkey autonomous weapons. And so this just demonstrates how mature the technology is, how widely available it is, and it certainly makes it difficult to think about how we're going to address this. Things that a decade ago were theoretical are now very real today. So how should we confront this challenge, given this widespread availability, but all of the legal and ethical and stability challenges that this technology poses? Are there ways that we can use AI technology to make war more precise and more humane, but without losing our humanity in the process? There are a wide range of views on what states should do about autonomous weapons, ranging from a preemptive, legally binding treaty that would ban autonomous weapons, to having no special regulation at all, relying on compliance with the law of war as it exists today. But there have been some areas of consensus. States have agreed in the CCW, the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, the forum in which states are coming together at the United Nations, that any use of autonomous weapons, like any other weapon, must comply with international law, and in particular the law of war. Further, states have agreed that at some level, humans must be involved in the use of lethal force. Now, this principle is characterized in different ways, with some states using terms like meaningful human control, others using terms like appropriate human judgment or necessary human involvement. Whatever label one uses, all of these terms express a similar sentiment, that at some level, humans should be involved in lethal decision-making on the battlefield. This is one potentially fruitful avenue to focus attention going forward, not just because it's an area of consensus, but because it is indeed the core question before us. Which tasks in war require uniquely human judgment, and why? Which tasks in war should only humans do, not because machines cannot do them, but because machines should not do them? This question points to an approach of dealing with this issue of autonomous weapons that focuses on the thing that is not changing as the technology advances: people. One of the difficulties in discussing autonomous weapons is that technology is moving forward so quickly that often any discussions about the state of the technology today is outpaced in a few years. And so it can be difficult to look at something and things that 9 years ago, when states began talking about autonomous weapons that seemed at the time like maybe science fiction, are now real and in some cases trivial today in the field of AI. And so regulating a technology that's moving this quickly is very challenging. People may have different assessments about the future pace of AI progress, and that could lead to differing judgments about regulation today. But even more importantly, even if everyone could agree about the future pace of progress and where we thought this was going, what we've seen historically is that countries often get it wrong when they have technology-based restrictions, because the technology often evolves in unpredictable ways. And so we could end up with regulations that turn out down the road to be ill-suited for how the technology actually evolves. Focusing on the human element in warfare, on the other hand, allows us to ground regulations in the aspect of war that is not changing, even as the technology moves forward. Similar to the ban on blinding lasers, which focuses on the intent behind the weapon, not the technology itself, a regulation on the human element of warfare could be robust to changes as the technology evolves. Now, there are going to be many areas in war and society overall where improvements in AI and autonomy will force us to ask difficult questions about where the line should be between what tasks are done by people and by machines. And that's going to be a difficult issue in the legal profession, in medicine, in finance, and other areas at the university setting, when people are wrestling with tools like ChatGPT and how should it be used by students. One of the things that's challenging is that line is going to move as AI technology becomes more capable. And in lots of instances, what will matter most is which is more accurate and reliable, humans or machines. If we want to avoid deaths on the highway, for example, we want cars that are safer regardless of how they're driven. One of the things that makes this difficult, of course, is that humans and machines fail in different ways. We certainly don't think the same way that these machines are processing information, and we see that they can fail differently. We can see this with self-driving cars, where we can have cars that are better than humans in some settings, and then in others, they turn lethal in an instant. A lot of the machines that we're seeing have a very narrow form of intelligence that's very brittle to changes in the environment or to how they're being used. And they often lack the flexibility to respond to novel situations. So it's not always as simple as just which is more accurate, because it might depend on the specific context in which it's being used. But for many settings, which is more accurate, humans or machines, will be a good guide for how we should use this technology. But there are going to be some important areas where there are asymmetries between humans and machines, regardless of how good the machines are. One of these is that in warfare, only humans are legal agents. It is humans that are responsible for ensuring compliance with the law of war. Machines can be tools that humans use to help ensure law of war compliance, but a human cannot pass that responsibility to a machine. Autonomous weapon is not a legal agent any more than a rifle is. Military personnel must ensure that their own actions are lawful. And it is humans, not machines, that are responsible for ensuring that a military's forces are engaging in lawful conduct. This implies some minimum necessary human involvement in the use of force. If, for example, one came to the conclusion that decisions about the lawfulness of an attack rested with humans, that would imply that the people making that judgment must have sufficient information about the attack to determine whether or not it's lawful. This could include information about the targets, the weapon that's being used, the surrounding environment that the targets are in, and the context for use, so that a human can make a judgment about the lawfulness of an attack. Now, the benefit of such a principle is that it would be robust to changes in technology, because it would focus on human responsibilities in war. And even as artificial intelligence improves, a principle for the role of human judgment in lethal decision-making could be a guiding star to help inform how states use this technology. There have been many other approaches to autonomous weapons, many other regulations that have been proposed. I want to take a moment to highlight two in particular. Anti-personnel autonomous weapons pose special problems from the standpoint of law of war compliance. Problems of distinction, of discriminating between military personnel and civilians, are heightened because combatants in modern wars do not always wear uniforms. Without uniforms, distinguishing combatants from civilians can be based on their behavior, which humans can do in wartime, imperfectly, and humans don't always get this right. It's difficult for humans. It would be much more difficult to program rules into a machine for how to make those judgments. Additionally, recognizing when someone has surrendered or is rendered over to combat is another special concern for anti-personnel autonomous weapons. For vehicles, autonomous weapons that target vehicles or equipment, it's a different matter. So if an autonomous weapon is targeting a vehicle, people can avoid being targeted by simply exiting the vehicle. Even for an autonomous weapon that is targeting military equipment like a rifle, a person can avoid being targeted by throwing down the rifle and walking away from it. There's no way to stop being a person. So this is a particular challenge for anti-personnel autonomous weapons. And this could be an area that requires special regulation. Another area that requires consideration is how autonomous systems interact pre-conflict in militarized disputes or crises, and the need for states to come together to develop rules of the road for how these systems might interact with each other. Autonomous weapons have the potential to undermine stability among nations if they open fire during a crisis and they cause unwanted escalation. There could be circumstances where the weapon is simply following its programming, but it takes actions that political leaders would wish it had not done had they had all that information in advance. Military forces sometimes interact in very tense situations. There was an incident not very long ago where Russia downed a US MQ-9 Reaper drone over the Black Sea. These types of incidents occur between militaries at times, and managing escalation is critical. And the ability to keep human control over escalation is vital to maintaining stability among countries. So states may wish to develop rules of the road for how autonomous weapons ought to behave within crises in order to avoid unwanted escalation. One interesting example from history is the success of the 1972 US-Soviet Incidents at Sea Agreement, which implemented confidence-building measures that successfully reduced collisions and near-collision incidents between the US and Soviet navies. As we consider these and other potential regulations on autonomous weapons, we should remember the lessons from historical successes of arms control. The importance of clear, bright lines on what is permissible and what is not, rules that states are able to comply with, rules that states can verify others' compliance for, and regulations where the horribleness of a banned weapon outweighs its military value. I'd like to close for a moment to reflect on some of the rapid developments that we've seen underway in artificial intelligence. We've seen, of course, AI dominating news headlines and tremendous advances recently. So even while we are grappling with this issue of autonomous weapons, the ground is shifting beneath our feet. AI technology is moving forward extremely rapidly, and no one can say for certain how the technology will evolve in the next 12 months, much less the decades to come. I've spent the better part of the last 15 years working on these technology areas, and I'm continually surprised by the rapid pace of advancement, particularly over the last year. We've seen in just the past few months astonishing progress in generative AI models. First, ChatGPT, which has over 100 million users now, and more recently, its successor, GPT-4, which achieved human-level performance across a wide range of cognitive tasks. These tools are very powerful. They have a wide range of beneficial uses across society. We're seeing companies develop apps to integrate them into all manner of different applications. But they also pose risks. One of the biggest challenges with these new AI models is that they are more general purpose than prior narrow AI systems. Much of the AI that we've seen over the last decade is very narrow systems. AlphaGo, the computer program that achieved superhuman performance at the Chinese strategy game Go, could only play the game of Go. It couldn't do anything else. Couldn't hold a conversation, couldn't write a poem, could not play chess, couldn't do anything else. Now, these new systems that are being designed can perform a more diverse range of tasks, including many things that are emergent within the model, things that it was not explicitly programmed to do, but there's information within its vast data set that it's trained on that it learns from in order to perform various tasks. These large language models are designed to predict the next word in a sentence. That's what they're designed to do. But the databases that they're trained on are massive. Hundreds of gigabytes of data, a good chunk of the text on the internet, in fact. The newest version, GPT-4, is a multimodal model. It uses both text and images. So now we're seeing different types of data incorporated. And because there's many different things in this data, it can learn a whole wide range of things. Sure, it can write text, but it can also play chess, because there's chess notation on the internet. It can write computer code, because there's computer code on the internet. It has been shown more recently that the most advanced version of this can synthesize chemical compounds, because there's information about chemistry on the internet. Now, many of these uses are beneficial, but some of them have potential to cause serious harm. Computer code can be used to write software, but also to write malware and carry out cyber attacks. And these systems are capable of enabling more capable cyber attacks. Synthesizing chemical compounds could be used for coming up with new drugs, but also dangerous chemical weapons. And these systems could be enablers of people wanting to cause harm. So we have some very important security-relevant applications that we need to pay attention to. These new AI models, because of their more general purpose abilities, are inherently dual use. The best AI scientists in the world right now don't know how to make these systems safe. They're working to put guardrails in place, but these guardrails are imperfect. So we don't know how to take out of these systems the ability to do bad things that comes along with the ability to do good things. And we don't know how to prevent users from finding ways around these safeguards to potentially get these systems to then carry out some malicious activity. This is a real problem at the moment. Some AI scientists have sounded the alarm about the risk of these AI models. Some have called for a pause on developing more capable systems until we better understand how to make them safe. Yet getting companies to cooperate has proven very challenging because there's a lot of money at stake. Just in search alone, just one application of these tools is worth over $100 billion annually in revenue. And so we're seeing companies competing to push this technology out the door, in many cases, even when it's not ready, because of the profit motives at stake. So the situation that we are in with the most capable AI systems is not a good one. The risks are high. They are perhaps even higher than the risk posed by autonomous weapons. Right now, companies are racing ahead to field a technology that they don't understand and that they cannot keep safe. And this is a recipe for disaster. We need increased funding for AI safety research. That's one key thing that we can do to address these risks of these new powerful AI systems. We should be investing in tools to make these massive black box systems more explainable and governable. Right now, we're in a situation where there are other AI approaches that are more explainable, that we can understand better, but they're not as capable as these massive models that use hundreds of billions of different connections in these neural networks. So we need to invest in tools that allow us to better peer into these black boxes, understand how they're functioning, and then have the ability to alter their behavior to make them safe. It also seems likely that some form of government regulation for these largest models, which are inherently dual use, will likely be needed. Fortunately, there is one area where we have an opportunity to control these systems, which is their hardware that they need to train these large models. This computation doesn't happen actually in a cloud. It happens at a data center somewhere, right? And so controlling the physical components of hardware becomes an opportunity to actually regulate these systems. Now, these systems are very computationally intensive. They're using thousands of very specialized chips running for weeks or months at a time to train these models. And so you need large amounts of computing hardware. In fact, the amount of computing hardware that's being used to train these models is doubling every 6 months. So that's much faster than the prior doubling that we've seen over the last several decades with Moore's law every 24 months. It's a very rapid rate of growth. It means these systems are becoming more capable very quickly, but also that hardware is a potentially valuable point of control over access to them. The largest and most capable models are using these massive computing resources, and so that gives us the ability to regulate who can access these systems. So states can control these by controlling different elements of this computing hardware across the life cycle of an AI model's development. There's 3 key phases where we have the opportunity to regulate these systems. One is at the level of the chips themselves. You need to access large amounts of these chips. So if we can control where the chips go, if we can track who has them, then we can prevent malicious actors from controlling large amounts of these chips. Just like we've managed the challenge of nuclear weapons globally by controlling access to the underlying technology behind nuclear weapons. Make it difficult to get your hands on large amounts of highly enriched uranium or plutonium to make a nuclear weapon. And so similarly, if we can control the hardware, we'll make it impossible to train these systems. We also need to control how the chips are used at these large data centers. So regulation surrounding the use of these hardware at data centers, so that companies are forced to know who their customers are, regulating large training runs to train new models, putting in cybersecurity requirements, and audit requirements are going to be important as steps to ensure that only responsible actors are using this computing hardware that's at these data centers, that it's not being used by malicious actors. And lastly, we're going to need controls on the trained models themselves. One of the difficulties of this technology is while it takes large amounts of chips to train these models, once the training process is done, all that information is compressed into a neural network that's a trained model, that's a piece of software that's easily transferred and exportable. It could be stolen or copied or leaked. In fact, a model by Meta recently leaked online. And so we also need to have controls around the trained models themselves. Cybersecurity requirements, regulations to ensure that they've been audited and red teamed, that they're going to be safe before they're being deployed, and holding the people who train them accountable for their use. So these are going to be some of the tools that we're going to need as we see this technology evolves, regulating it across the entire life cycle of these new models that are very dual use and have the potential to cause great harm. We control access to other dangerous technologies like highly enriched uranium, and we're fast moving into an era where controlling access to large amounts of computing hardware is going to be essential for ensuring that this technology is used safely. So states are going to have to cooperate to find ways to do that, and cooperate to work with frontier AI labs and the private sector to regulate how this technology is being used. As we see AI develop, we're going to need to continue to be flexible and adaptable to respond to risks that we foresee on the battlefield and in society writ large. History suggests that we can be successful in restraining dangerous new technologies, but we need to heed the lessons of history about what makes restraint more successful. We need to come together and find ways to manage these dangerous new technologies. The consequences of failure are too great. I am hopeful that we're able to do so. The history of arms control shows that successful restraint of dangerous weapons is possible under the right conditions. We are most likely to succeed if we heed the lessons of the past while working to make a better future. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Paul. That was very insightful. Is that comfortable for you? It's okay there?
Thanks.
Thank you. I know that people haven't come here to have sweet dreams tonight. There's an awful lot there. I have a few questions here myself, but we also have a roving microphone, at least one, so I'm going to open up the floor to the audience as well, but I won't keep you from your drinks. Firstly, incredible amount of knowledge in there. I was making notes, but in preparing for this, I also looked at some talks you've given before, and I saw that when you were before the Subcommittee on Ireland of the Senate Armed Services Committee in 2017, you wrote on the point of air-ground robotic systems. Russia has been developing a fleet of ground robotic vehicles, including some that are armed, and has employed uninhabited aircraft as forward observers for artillery in the Ukraine. You wrote that 6 years ago. I mean, also, you can use this for surveillance. Could you have predicted what's happening in Ukraine, for example?
Well, I think some of those I got right, some of those I got pretty wrong. So I want to own up to that. I think there are some ways in which we've seen drones being used over the last decade that are clearly playing out in the conflict in Ukraine. And the biggest one is the use of drones for overhead surveillance and reconnaissance as spotters for artillery. And so on social media, you see a lot of videos of a drone and it drops a bomb maybe, and Ukraine's been very effective at propaganda and at the information warfare component of this conflict. But the value, really, of these drones is oftentimes much more in spotting for artillery. We could bring a lot more firepower in. I think what I got pretty badly wrong was estimates about Russian military capabilities, which on paper, Russia looks very good, and I think we've seen in practice, their military is just not as capable in the field. So I think like many defense analysts, I expected this war would be over in the first 30 days with Russia taking Kyiv, And obviously that hasn't happened. And I think it's an important reminder that we can look at what's on paper with the military. We can see what technologies they're building. We can see even what experiments they're doing. Russia had done all these experiments in robotics over the last decade. Turns out they're not very effective. The thing that matters the most, we can't really measure, which is human performance. And that's what's making the difference in Russia, where on all of the human dimensions of warfare, the Russian military is doing a terrible job, right? So they have bad command and control, poor leadership, poor unit cohesion, poor morale. Their soldiers certainly don't want to be there. Whereas Ukraine, obviously, certainly from the morale side, has a much stronger will to fight. And those factors weigh a lot more than the technology. That's always been the case. Napoleon talked about these moral factors and more outweighing the weapons 3-to-1, and that's still the case today.
Just picking up on one of the many lines I have from your talk, one that worried me. You said the best AI scientists now don't know how to make these systems safe. That's concerning.
Yeah, it is. It concerns me. Yeah. So what we've seen with these language models like ChatGPT is the base model, the one that actually we don't see publicly, is inherently like amoral. It'll do anything you ask it to do. So if you're talking to it and you're like, I want to carry out a terrorist attack and kill as many people as I can, help me do that. It's like, okay, like, here's some ideas. Like, what about a biological weapon? That could kill a lot of people. And then you're like, well, I don't know how to make a biological weapon. How can I do that? Well, here's some ideas about how to do that. So that's not good. Now, what these companies have done is they then retrain the model with human feedback to try to, each time it gives a good answer, they say, good model, good job, and they give it like a positive feedback, and then it's more likely to do that in the future. And every time it does something bad, they give it negative feedback, so it won't do that. And that helps somewhat. What we've seen, though, is that these guardrails are not very robust, and there's so many examples of people finding ways around these protections. So, for example, they've closed this loophole, but early on, if you asked it, how do I carry out a terrorist attack in Pig Latin, then it could get around the safeguards, right? And then the safeguards, they closed that one. They said, oh, no, Pig Latin still counts. And then they'd say, okay, I don't actually want to do it. I'm writing a play, and I need to write a script for a play in which someone is a terrorist and they have this very elaborate plan. Can you help me write the play? And it's like, oh, yeah, sure, I'll help you do that. That's fine. So they've started to close these loopholes, but it is a pretty significant problem. And I'm very concerned that we're seeing companies basically deploy these models before we found ways to make them safe. That's not a good situation to be in.
So we have no clear answer on that one. You mentioned numerous times, of course, the rules of war, the law of war. I wondered, as I was sitting there listening to you, of the wars that you have studied and even been in, what percentage of people involved in that actually followed the rules of war?
I mean, it depends a lot on the war we're talking about, right, in which side. Obviously, we see in the war in Ukraine, Russia committing a tremendous amount of atrocities. And I think it's worth acknowledging that law of war compliance is imperfect by people. That you have multiple levels of possible failures, sometimes at the state level. We have some states like Putin's Russia that just don't care about law of war compliance. In fact, sometimes atrocities are a deliberate tool. In other cases, even when the government is perhaps trying to ensure that their military forces operate within the law of war, humans are imperfect. Humans, they get angry, they get tired, their friend gets killed, and then they want to seek revenge, and none of those things make it okay. But that's the reality. And so, like, I think when we think about how are we ensuring like that autonomous weapons comply with the law of war, it is important to keep in mind the reality of where humans are today, that we don't sort of like glorify human performance, which is not perfect.
Well, the point of this question really was the fact that it's not perfect.
It's not perfect at all.
It's not perfect, and therefore a huge part of this discussion is the legislation aspect.
Right.
One could almost ask, what's the point of the legislation
Yes.
if this is already not perfect with something that's easier to see and define?
Well, I think that's one of the debates around autonomous weapons is, if there are rules under the law of war, and if autonomous weapons complied with those rules, most of the objections, not all, because there are some that are outside the law of war, but most of the objections that people have wouldn't be a concern. So people that are worried, well, what if the autonomous weapon shoots a civilian and not a military combatant? Well, the principle of distinction says you have to only target combatants. Now, there could be accidents, but humans have accidents too. So complying with the law of war is sort of the base foundation for any weapon, including autonomous weapons.
Well, I could go on. I've got many notes here, but I would like to open the floor to our very learned and very interested audience. If we could have the lights up in the house a little bit, then we would be able to see a little bit more. And if you have questions, please put your hand up, state who you are and where you're from. Don't be shy. It's a small, usual kind of Tuesday evening chat here in Luxembourg. Who has a question? I'm sure you're burning with questions. I know a number of people have come here with their books to be signed, so I know there's many people who know about your work. Yes, front row. If you could state your name and your organization.
Sure. Good evening. Osman Noor from Stop Killer Robots. Thank you for a very insightful and educational discussion. One view on the need for legislation is that rather than this being a sort of a preemptive ban on a future-based weapon system, is that we've actually always had, historically, meaningful human control over the use of force. With the example that you gave about the little girl, you were able to use your discernment, your ethics, in order to make a decision. In the systems that we've had historically, we've been able to exercise meaningful human control. Systems are sufficiently predictable in order to comply with IHL. So could we say that rather than preventing something in the future, we're actually needing to preserve what we already have? Would you agree with that? Do we already have meaningful human control, and is this about keeping that?
Well, we certainly already have human decision-making over the use of force. It depends a little bit on what one means by this term meaningful human control, which is this sort of label that's caught on, and I've heard different definitions of it. I've heard some that would require a very direct type of human control over the use of force that weapons dating as far back as like the catapult wouldn't apply to, right? But one of the, I think, points that you're drawing out that I think is quite compelling is some people have said, well, why do we need some new rule for autonomous weapons? We already have the law of war. And I think the argument is, one of the arguments is, humans have always been making these decisions. We didn't have to write it down because there's no other way to do it. And now we have this choice. And so if we want humans to still be involved in these decisions, we have to write down that rule. The question is, what does it look like? In fact, I don't know anyone that has suggested that humans should not be involved at all in lethal decision-making. The question is, like, setting aside for a moment the label of meaningful human control or some other term, like, what does that look like in practice? And I think there's a couple ways to approach it. One is from the legal standpoint, like, what do you need in order to comply with the law of war? Another one is from past practice, which is what has humans been doing? I think it's also a very fruitful way to look at this problem is to say, well, what are we already doing right now? Because we have circumstances where we have decision-making distributed across multiple people, where people might be making different decisions across a kill chain to make a decision to carry out an attack. We certainly have lots of decisions that are mediated through sensors, where someone isn't visually looking at a target, not always. But people are understanding the decision they're making. They are weighing the information about the target and about the context for use. And so, if we have to write those rules down, what do those look like about just what we're doing today, and then what do we want to carry forward? I think that's a very helpful way to approach the problem.
Thank you for that question. I know that we have more questions. Yes, the first hand shot up was the lady with the glasses here. A microphone will come to you quite soon. Thank you. And I saw two other hands shoot up. So firstly, we'll take your question. Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Shah. My name is Claire. I am representing Luxembourg at the Cooperative Cyber Defense Centre of Excellence in Tallinn. And I was actually going to ask if you think there is a possibility that we can regulate this. And from your speech, it sounds very much like you can. Having spent a rather frustrating week in Geneva last year at the UN Group of Government Experts on Laws, where we did not even manage to decide how many days we will meet in this year, do you have any suggestions on how we can actually break a deadlock at a forum such as the UN, because any form of regulation that we would need would have to be a global one? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's true. So the perspective I was coming from in this talk was really sort of looking at broader historical attempts, which I think there's a lot of room for maybe optimism. For those who've been down in the trenches in the meetings at the UN, at the group of governmental experts, it may be more pessimistic. I've been to many of the meetings, at least early on for several years, and progress has been moving slower the last couple of years. Some could say that it's stalled out. Maybe others might debate that. I do think the political environment for arms control right now is not great for a couple of reasons. One is the structure of the CCW, the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, is a consensus-based organization. So it only takes one state to say no, and then nothing happens. And for anyone who's been involved with the CCW in any capacity, people are well aware of this very frustrating aspect of it. It can make it a powerful vehicle when states do reach agreement, but it also, in many cases, is just an obstacle to progress. We've seen in the past, for bans on cluster munitions and landmines, that a group of like-minded states just moved outside and created their own. We've not yet seen that with autonomous weapons. It's possible that that certainly occurs. I think what's clear where we are with autonomous weapons now is a standalone treaty would not have major military powers involved, which is going to very significantly, I would say, weaken its effect if you don't have actually countries that are sort of leading the development in terms of militaries being a part of that treaty. I also think it's worth acknowledging that the political climate internationally for arms control has gotten much worse over the last 20 years. That after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, there was a period where we had a lot of arms control, both on the humanitarian side and on the more stability side with things like START and New START, that have become much more difficult. Obviously, when you're seeing the kind of aggression that Russia's engaging in Europe, it's hard to, why would you trust what Russia says they're going to do? China has not shown any willingness to engage in arms control, even on other areas like, say, ballistic missiles working or nuclear weapons working with, for example, Russia and the United States. So I think the broader international climate at the moment is not good, and that's pessimistic. But if you take a step back at maybe the broader view, there are times when we can see the political environment is more conducive to arms control. And I think there's benefit in thinking about what would agreements look like, what's feasible, what's practical, to then seize those opportunities if and when they arise.
Thank you for that lovely question. Would you like some water? I know that there was a hand up on this side. A hand flew up on this side. Yes, the lady with the long hair here, yes.
Thank you very much for a wonderful speech. My name is Piret Pernik. I'm a colleague actually of Claire. And I wanted to ask about your recent piece in War on the Rocks, where I think you alluded that those narrow AI games as Go, chess, and poker that could be used to enhance decision making. And I just wonder if you could elaborate on that, because it seems to me that they are still narrow. They can't understand the context. They don't have ability to make causal interference. And so are there any, is it hypotheses? And when would that happen? Are there any examples that, for example, China is considering that in the military side? Thank you.
Sure, thank you. So I have a new book that just came out on artificial intelligence. It's called Four Battlegrounds, Power in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. And it looks at how AI technology is being used around the world in global security, including in warfare. And one of the things that I was very interested to dig into in the book was when we see AI systems reaching human level or sometimes superhuman performance in different games, oftentimes these AI systems play differently than humans. If it's games like chess, Go, poker, computer games, we've seen that it's not just that the AI systems are better than people, they actually play in different ways. And I wanted to see, are there any commonalities across these different games? It turns out there actually are, which is, I thought, fascinating. And I think is interesting lessons for warfare, which is what the article was about. So some of them are things that you would expect, things like machines can move faster than people, or have greater precision. But we also see the ability of these AI systems to have better situational awareness, so they can process more information holistically over this game space. They often do a better job at risk management, of tailoring their actions to sort of like very precisely calibrate the risk of the actions they're performing, whether it's betting strategies in poker or playing computer games. In some cases, they can engage in better long-term planning than humans, not all the time. But in chess, for example, they can. They can come up with novel tactics. And so in chess and in Go, they've come up with new opening moves that humans hadn't seen before, and that humans are now trying to understand. So there's all sorts of interesting ways where these systems are able to do things differently than people, which has advantages. But I think it also has risk because, and this is, I think, really key, these systems don't think like humans do. So we often have this vision of intelligence as like this staircase from, ants to mice to chimpanzees to humans, and we're building more intelligent systems. And maybe we'll get to machines that have human-level intelligence someday, possibly someday soon, possibly. And it turns out that's probably not the best way to think about intelligence, because what we're seeing is that human intelligence is one space in a whole vast space of possible forms of intelligence. That the systems we're building, they are intelligent in some ways that are different than how humans are. And that has advantages, but also risk, because we need to be dealing with the fact that we're interacting with something that thinks in very different ways than people.
Thank you. I know we had a question somewhere near the front row. Yes, in the front row here. And while the microphone, two questions in the front row. While the microphone's going there, you mentioned your books, and I know a number of people here have the books to be signed, which is wonderful. You were named in 2018 as one of Bill Gates' top 5 books. Did that throw you into a different stratosphere of, did people suddenly wake up to what it is that you talk about, and were you suddenly in high demand because Bill Gates has put you as on a pedestal of one of his best books, and everything that he's written about you is extraordinary, and I think he said it's the book he's been waiting for.
Yeah, he said that. He did say that. Well, I don't know about stratosphere, but there was a Bill Gates bump. Yeah, people do listen to Bill Gates, people follow him, so that was very nice. It was very kind. He wrote a very nice, said some very nice things about the book, and he enjoyed it. And it turns out a lot of people pay attention to him, so it did help draw interest in the book, which is great. You put all this effort into these books, and then you want to get them out in the hands of people, you want people to enjoy them. So it's nice to be able to share them with people.
And did he give you any feedback or comments?
Oh, no, not specific, not other than he wrote like a review, or probably had one of his people write a review, right? But had a review online, but not like specifically, no.
Or maybe he used a technological advancement to write a review somehow. I'm pretty sure it was him. I'm sure. Yeah. We'll go with it.
These days, yeah, you could do that.
Yes, hello, thank you. My name is Stephanie. I'm the chair of the Defense Committee in the Luxembourg Parliament. So actually, as a lawmaker, I do have quite some interest in this topic. And what I get from this evening is really we need to regulate as much as possible. Now, don't get me wrong here with what I'm about to say, because I'm really not at ease with the thought of having machines taking, for example, lethal decisions. But when I'm trying to find arguments in my head against it, I mean, you gave some, but then most of the arguments you gave could be applied to humans as well. So that's a problem. So what I have in my head actually contradicts my impulse to regulate as much as possible. You said, for example, that machines should not take decisions for a lethal attack, not because they cannot do them or take them, but because they should not do it. But then again, you said also that machines are more rational. They take decisions like they don't want revenge, for example. You cited that example as well. So also artificial intelligence is becoming ever more capable, where I wouldn't be so sure about humankind. So could you imagine a scenario where artificial intelligence would actually take better decisions, more reliable decisions than humans? Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it depends on the types of decisions we're talking about. So let me give an example. I think if we have decisions, whether in warfare or elsewhere, where we have lots of good data on performance, and we have clear metrics for what better looks like, we often can train machines to do that task, and eventually probably better than humans. So in driving, for example, we care about the safety track record. How many miles can you drive without an accident? That's a place where we have a clear metric of better performance. If you could be safer on the roads, have fewer accidents, save lives, that's good. Some decisions in war are like that. So for example, if you had a person and they're standing in a crowded alleyway and they're holding something in their hands, and we want to know, what are they holding? Is it a rifle or is it a rake in their hands? That's something that we could train a machine to do. And in fact, machine learning-based image classifiers is a solved problem.
Unless one is being disguised as the other, which you also talked about.
Well, that could be a concern, yes. All right, that could be a concern. But you might be able to, if you had even good data sets for like camouflage things, maybe you could train machines to do that, right? Or maybe better than people. But that's a place where you could find metrics for that performance, where you could measure it and you could see, is it getting better? Now let's say you said, okay, we can identify it's a rifle. Now there's a judgment of, is this person a combatant? That's actually more difficult because it might depend on the context, right? And different people actually may come to different judgments based on the particular circumstances. And so I think it's worth maybe separating out things where there's a fact-based decision, there might be a clear metric of performance versus something that would require something more like what we'd think of as judgment. And those might be areas where we still want to have humans doing those.
Well, that comes full circle to your first example of the girl with the goats.
Exactly.
I don't think we have any clear answer there. Patrick.
Hello, my name is Pascal Steichen. I'm the director of the House of Cybersecurity here in Luxembourg. You mentioned that general purpose AI is or will probably become more dangerous than autonomous weapon systems. And you suggested a very interesting opportunity for regulation based on hardware constraints, basically. How the quantum computing components comes in there?
Yeah. So the good news, I guess, here from like a scary technology standpoint, is that progress in quantum computing or other quantum technologies is moving at a much slower pace, which gives us more time. And so there are some areas where quantum computing could be very disruptive. One of the things that quantum computing could do, if we could have a future quantum computer that is capable enough, is break known forms of encryption. Now, this is a major problem from an intelligence standpoint, because not just does this pose a risk to your intelligence on the day that this quantum computer is built, what some people have called Q day, when you could break encryption, but it also is a risk retroactively. Because if an enemy has been storing your communications that have been encrypted, they can now go back and decrypt all of these older messages, essentially even going back decades, which could reveal your sources and methods. And so there's, I think, a compelling need for intelligence services to move to basically quantum-proof methods of encryption in the near future to shore up against this possibility. But we don't know when that might occur. It's possible that it could happen tomorrow. Really scary answer is it's already happened and we don't know yet. I don't think that's actually likely. But it's also possible that it's decades away, or it turns out to be extremely difficult to do that because there's no Moore's law for quantum computers, which in this case is somewhat reassuring, but it is potentially a very disruptive technology.
We have another hand shooting up there, 2 hands on this side. Any further questions? Keep your hands up so the microphones can go to you. Another one here on the end. We'll go to this side first. Yeah, exactly, they've had their hands up first. Perfect. And keep your hands in mind. I don't want to keep you too long from the drinks outside. So we'll have a few more questions. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Lenzini Gabriele. I'm a professor here in Luxembourg. And I have a question for a researcher. You mentioned that researchers are not having put that safer. I think is a good challenge. And for me, the question is that what actually are the capabilities that you would like to see or you challenge a researcher to put in AI in order to make this safer? For example, I can mention the fact should we consider the capacity to recognize and process emotions, which is something that logicians and philosophers of mind are trying to do already in other paradigm of AI. Or should we be able to embed ethical and moral rules in AI reasoning, or maybe the ability to react faster to the environment, right? There's neural cameras that are working like the brain, recognize differences faster. Or maybe, I don't know, the ability to think ahead about the consequences of the decision. So what is your challenge for the research world in order that we can work on it? Thank you.
Yeah, so one of the things that's remarkable is this progress we've seen in these large language models has really upended the field in the last few years. And of course, some of these models have been around for a couple years now, maybe the last 2 or 3 years, and have just come more publicly recently. Although even in just the last couple months, we've seen more progress with GPT-4, for example. And so lots of things that seemed really hard a few years ago, actually these models can do. So they can reason about the effects of their actions. So if you said, I want to do X, what might be the consequences of that? It could actually reason about that pretty good. If you said, I want to hold a conference on autonomous weapons, it could write you an agenda for the conference, come up with speakers. It could, write you your opening remarks. I didn't use it for my speech, I promise.
Have you used ChatGPT for speech making?
I didn't use it. But I've played with it, and it's really capable. It's not bad, right? And so it can do a lot of these things. The biggest problem right now is that the people training the systems can't get it to do what they want it to do reliably. So if they say, I don't tell people how to make chemical weapons or how to carry out a terrorist attack, that's not reliable right now. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And the models themselves are not quite capable enough to cause a lot of harm, but that's probably not that far away given the pace of progress. And that's a real concern. So the number one thing is, how do we get these systems to do what we want them to do? A lot of concern is focused on, these systems tend to say harmful things. If you ask it, give me an offensive joke, it will happen to give you a joke. It might offend whatever group you want to offend. That's like hurting someone's feelings is not great, but that's not going to kill people. But we can't get it to just control what it says. And so that's the real problem. It's not that it's going to say something offensive. Really, it's that we can't get it to do whatever we want it to do, and that's when we need to focus our attention.
Well, as we were saying before this began, words do have an effect, and we've seen that in your home country, what happened in Washington, your home city, in fact,
right.
not so long ago, where people... Anyway, let's park that. Question right at the back of the hall.
Thank you. I'm Anna Hare from Future of Life Institute, and I want to thank you for referring to our recent open letter that we published calling for a pause on AI development. My question actually revolves around, or builds upon your point on a different set of risks surrounding anti-personnel systems targeting humans. And I wondered if you could comment on the potential security and societal risks of these weapons being used on the battlefield, but also off the battlefield, by non-state actors and civilians themselves, with perhaps quite crude, easy-to-produce autonomous weapons, with hardware that we can purchase online, with software that we can code ourselves or get from the internet, using facial recognition to target particular individuals or types of individuals, using one munition or hundreds or even more. I wondered if you could comment on that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And first of all, I should say, if people have not seen the letter from the Future of Life Institute, it's certainly worth checking out. This is the one that you mentioned that called for a number of AI scientists calling for a 6-month pause on AI development, given some of these risks. It's generated a lot of interest and discussion in the AI community, and I think, really kudos to FLI for leading forward on this issue and generating that debate. Yeah, the widespread availability of this technology is a real concern. So when I was doing book talks for my first book, Army of None, I was giving a talk at a major American university. I'm not going to say which one, but it's a household name. And afterwards, this professor pulled me aside. He was a robotics professor in the robotics department. He said, I want to show you something. I said, okay, what do you got? So he takes me down his lab, and he's got this laptop that's open, and wired up to the laptop is this little robot arm, and in the arm is this airsoft pistol. So it's this little pistol that shoots, these little BBs. And the camera's on, and so we're in the camera field of view, and there's this little box in the middle. And honestly, I don't know what I was thinking. Naturally, I just saw I lined my head up so I'm inside the box. Why you do that? And the box turns yellow, and the thing pulls the trigger. Now there was nothing in it, but I heard it chunk, and I jumped out of my skin. I was like, your robot just tried to shoot me. And he was like, yeah, that's pretty cool, huh? And I was like, no, it's not. It's at a minimum, it's rude, but why would you do that? And so he basically built a very simple autonomous weapon. And I was like, this is disturbing. How did you build this? And he said that he built it basically in an afternoon. That he downloaded the software online, changed a few lines of code. He said the hardest part was physically wiring in the robot hand into this gun. It's that's a real problem when we think about this. Now, I think scaling up physical attacks will be difficult. And the unfortunate reality is that you can kill more people with, a truck driving into a crowd, or, if you in the United States with an assault rifle. We have obviously a lot of problems with gun violence in the U.S. And so there are other ways to also cause harm, but I do think it's a concern, and it's something we want to pay attention to when we think about how do we regulate this technology to avoid these kinds of harms.
Well, that sounds like an afternoon of fun for an MIT student.
I'm
not
nice try.
Anyhow, I know we have another question, third row behind Sergio Coronado.
Thank you. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I very much enjoyed this part of it as well, the speech and the Q&A. You said, Paul, and I'm paraphrasing, that for states to...
Paul, sorry, who are you and where are you from?
Yes, good question, thank you. So I'm Cesar Jaramillo, I'm the director of Project Plowshares in Canada. And you said, and I'm paraphrasing, that for a state to give up a certain category of weapon, there would need to be a recognition at the end of the day that the downsides outweigh the military advantage. In your assessment, what's the status of these two dimensions of the conversation in the militarily advanced countries, and let's say US and China, but of course others? Is more attention being paid to the military advantages, or is more attention being paid to the downsides? And really, and this is speculative, but do you feel that there's one, because these are mutually exclusive sort of directions, is there one direction that you feel this is headed in the military establishment in the US, in the military establishment in China and elsewhere? Thank you.
Yeah, I think certainly among military establishments, much more attention to being employed to the possible military value of these technologies, and a strong desire to at least have the ability to use them. I think there's a lot of uncertainty about exactly how would autonomous weapons be used and what are the circumstances in which they'd be valuable. Might be ironically, given that I wrote a book on this, I think they're probably not as valuable in war as some people might think they're likely to be, because there's a lot of value that humans have, right? That you can bring humans, if you can keep humans in the loop. Human intelligence is pretty valuable. But within the US, we've seen a number of different policy documents. In fact, they just updated the Defense Department's policy on autonomy in weapons a few months ago that had put in place some pretty rigorous procedures surrounding reviewing any kind of development of autonomous weapons and testing these weapons to make sure that they're reliable. I don't know that we've seen other states, certainly we've not seen out of China any kind of information at all about whether they have an internal decision-making process that would try to vet these systems. I suspect that, even if they do, it's probably not very robust, although they may not have any special process, which I think is concerning. But understandably, militaries are, their job is to defend their country. That's what they're focused on. And of course, given Russia's invasion of Ukraine, given the massive military buildup that we've seen China undertaking in the last 20 years in the Western Pacific, there's a lot of concern among countries about making sure that they're improving their national defense.
Thank you for that question. I will take 2 more questions from the floor. We have one at the end there. Yes, and while the final person, no pressure, is thinking of their question.
Hello. Wessel van Waveren, I'm insurer, work for Van Breda Risk and Benefits here in Luxembourg. Of course, as an insurer, the question is liability. The weapon shoots the girl, and finally she was listening to a football match, and she was not a terrorist. Would the weapon be liable? Would maybe the unit that used the weapon be liable? Would the government that provided the weapon be liable? Or would the producer of the weapon, the factory who made it, be liable? Does it change anything about the situation that we have today on liability for weapons?
Yeah.
Another aspect of the monetization of this.
Well, it's a great question, and it's one of the more difficult ones with autonomous weapons that frequently comes up. So most of the analysis that I've heard is that you wouldn't hold the weapon accountable. That doesn't make a lot of sense, and it's probably not a constructive way to think about it. But there are a couple other possible solutions. In a civilian setting, sometimes you'd hold the manufacturer accountable. If there's a defect in a product and then someone is harmed, you would hold the manufacturer accountable. When I worked at the Pentagon and we looked at this, we could not find examples where when there were failures of weapon systems and there was harm, that we held the manufacturer accountable, in part because the defense industry is one that is solely oriented at government, right? So it's a monopsony market where the government sets the requirements for these weapon systems, and the government does their independent testing afterwards. And so the focus in the case of accidents by the government was always, how do we find out what went wrong, and how do we fix it? And just how do we correct it? Now, of course, there are circumstances in which people employing technology, whether it's weapons or other autonomous technology, they're the ones that are held liable. In some cases, justifiably, they made a mistake, they were careless. There are other circumstances in which we sometimes treat the person, what one analyst has called as sort of the moral crumple zone. The human becomes a scapegoat. And we've seen this in the case of things like airplane autopilots in commercial airline accidents, where the autopilots are very capable, and oftentimes if there's a mistake, we then end up blaming the pilot. Right? One of the functions of pilots is to then have someone there in the cockpit that we can put the blame on when something goes wrong. And the 737 MAX crashes were an example of this, where afterwards, some of the blame, people said, well, the pilot did the wrong thing here, rather than a more diffuse process of the company that built the system, the testers, the regulators, all of these other institutions that should have been ensuring that they were putting out a system when it was safe, and then had the training appropriate for the people using it.
A wonderful question. We'll take one more question from the floor, and while people are thinking about putting their hands up, please do. Yes, we have a question here.
Thank you very much. My name is Jonathan from Saab Dynamics in Sweden. So I think you mentioned, thank you very much for the talk, by the way, that one essential part of regulation is the monitoring of compliance or conformance. Are there any viable strategies really for monitoring the development of AI or AGI and autonomous weapon systems?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So monitoring can be verification can be very difficult if the thing you're trying to verify is embedded in software. So if you had 2 identical systems, 2 identical drones, for example, and one has a human in the loop and one is fully autonomous, and the difference is in the software, that could be very hard to verify. Now, maybe you could get states to agree to some very intrusive inspection where they're going in and they're looking at the code. It seems unlikely, but maybe you could get states to do that. But even if they did, there's a risk that then after the inspectors leave, just update the software. Right? You can make these software updates at scale very quickly across all of your enterprises. So that's a big problem. So what would be some other approaches? Well, one would be that if you could instantiate the thing that you're concerned about in the physical hardware itself, so that what you were actually telling states it couldn't do was build something that had certain physical characteristics that were observable. What does that mean? Well, if you look at regulations that we've done in the past surrounding WMD-capable missiles, the Missile Technology Control Regime and the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, both of those were aimed at WMD-capable missiles, but they didn't actually say you could build this missile, but you just can't put a nuclear warhead in it. What the regulations did was they banned any missile of a certain class, certain payload or range, because that was the thing that you could see. So they just looked at the whole platform and said, anything that was this type we can observe, you can't do, rather than say you can build the missiles, but you just can't put nuclear warheads in them, which we can't actually visibly do. So let's say you're worried about anti-personnel autonomous weapons. The type of autonomous weapon that you would build physically to go after a person is going to be different than what you would use to go after a tank or a submarine or some other military object. So if you were attacking a radar, you would have a large military drone that would be going after radars. To going after people, you might have these like smaller drones that might be maneuverable even indoors. And so you could imagine a set of regulations that says you just can't build armed drones of certain sizes that are aimed at targeting people, whether you regulate the size of the payload or the explosive or whatever, focusing on anti-personnel weapons, rather than saying you can build anti-personnel drones, you just have to have a human in the loop, which you can't actually see. So that could be like one possible approach, for example.
Well, just to wrap up, I wanted to bring us back to one of the statements you made, which is, what does success look like? And you've spent a career in this. You're an academic, you've written books, you're absolutely swimming in the research, but you've also done tours, you've been in the field, where I imagine your gut has to play an instinct. So thinking about your gut instinct, those fast decisions, your head instinct with all of the research that you have, what does success look like? And please give us a positive. We all want to sleep well tonight.
Yeah. Look, I think one of the things that I take away is, despite all of the progress that we've seen in AI and autonomy, is that none of these systems are as capable as humans are, and they certainly can't exercise human judgment and carrying forward human values, like we've talked about. And so there's a lot of value in keeping humans involved in these decisions. Humans don't always get it right, but humans can come to these decisions in warfare and can at times recognize the humanity of the other people that they're facing, and they can make decisions based on that, and we want to preserve that as we're moving forward with this technology.
Thank you for that lovely succinct answer there, and thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I know that we've all enjoyed it here. So again, Paul, thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
And with that, with usual Luxembourg hospitality, please enjoy the networking session. I know everybody will want to talk to Paul, and we'll see many of you back here tomorrow morning to start at 10 a.m. Thank you and good evening. Thank you again, Paul.
Thank you.